Good evening. Whether you own a local store or a big company, this webinar is for you. No one likes to think too much to the future, especially about their business. But in the next hour, we're going to find out why planning ahead is crucial. I'm welcoming here this evening two experts who will explain how to avoid common mistakes while preparing for the exit in succession from your business. Hi, I'm Michael Hinman. I'm executive editor here at Herald Community Newspapers. Joining us today is Joseph Milizio. He is the managing partner of Vishnick McGovern Milizio. He's the head of firms of business and transactional practice, mergers and acquisitions. Joseph represents startups, retailers, manufacturers, real estate entities, and other professional industries. And he was also just named on our exclusive list of LI Herald's top lawyers. That's fantastic and not surprised. Under his leadership, BMM was named Best Law Firms in America by U.S. News and World Report for both 2022 and 2023. So congratulations on that. And also joining us is Anthony Citrolo. He's a CPA, CMAA, a CEPA. You'll have to explain what all those mean. But he's the founder of the NYBB Group. And so that is a full-service boutique merger and acquisition and business advisory firm. Anthony's clients include privately held companies and family-owned businesses. And we're talking about companies that have from 5,000 in revenue to 5 million. Anthony is a CPA and a CEPA, which is, by the way, is a certified exit planning advisor and develops comprehensive strategies for owners and families. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening, Michael.
Good evening, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing well. Everybody looks like we're all ready to talk. We're talk shop, I guess, right? Talk some business.
Certainly.
We sure are. Absolutely.
And I feel like I'm a little nervous with such a greatness here. So great expertise for sure. So so I guess it's just we'll just jump into some questions. When is the best time to start planning?
Well, I would say the best time to start planning is the moment a client walks into my office and says, I have a concept, I'd like to start a new business. And if they start the right way from inception, they will in fact have a lead on themselves, quite honestly, because what will happen at that point is they will structure their business in a way that it will be most efficient for the business to operate, whether it be from a tax perspective or from a strictly operational perspective or from a technology perspective for that matter. So the day a person walks into my office, we talk about choice of entities, what type of entity the business should be structured as, who the owners will be, or at least the initial owners will be, and what the future plans are for the business.
So, Michael, I think Joe's absolutely right, especially for those folks who are starting a new business. And I think for anyone who is acquiring another business of someone else, okay, perhaps they're acquiring a business that's been around for 10 years or 20 years or fewer years. I think they really should take the lead of some of the large investment companies. And when they buy a business, they buy it with their exit in mind. Believe it or not, they say, hey, listen, we want to exit this business in 3 to 5 years to 7 years. And they build the business and grow the business accordingly. I'm not saying everyone should exit their business in 3 or 5 or 7 years, but if you actually buy the business or start the business with the exit in mind, two things happen. One, you'll always be growing the business. And two, if someone comes knocking on your door and says, hey, I'd like to buy your company, you will be absolutely ready to cash in on really what may be one of the biggest efforts you ever have in your life.
You know, that's kind of an interesting approach, which many people probably don't even think about, even business owners. It's almost because a lot of us would think about like when you buy a house, like, oh, I bought this house, I'm going to live here for the rest of my life. You're not sitting there thinking like, I'm going to buy this house for 3 to 5 years, up its value, and then flip it, unless you're a house flipper. But I mean, but that is the strategy you have to take, right? When yeah, I'm sure we'd all like to own business for forever, but at a certain time, you want to have it at its peak value, I'm assuming, and that's when you want to be able to sell, and you want to build it up to that peak value.
Yeah, and it always surprises me when people say, I found the perfect house. I don't have to do anything to it, right? And then 3 or 4 months in, they're revising this and remodeling that. and they'll have a conversation where they'll say, oh yeah, this isn't up to our decor or whatever it might be. And that's often the case with businesses as well. They might come into a business as a purchase and say, okay, this is a great business, it's a great opportunity for us. But that's usually not the case. Usually they come in and they discover all of the unusual history of operations, let's say, and things that do need to be taken care of and, for lack of a better term, upgraded.
Also, Michael, I think, someone really look at that, instead of looking at the business that you acquire or start as something that you necessarily will be in for the next 40 or 50 years or 30 years or whatever it is, look at it as an investment, right? You're going to invest a certain amount of capital, a lot of time. Sometimes people spend more time in their business than they spend at home. And look at it as an investment. Oftentimes we find when someone looks at their business, sometimes 80% of their net worth or their actual value, their personal net worth is really trapped and tied into the business. And if there's a way where you can kind of cash in on that at some point, it may not have to be 20 or 30 years. Years ago, folks started their business. It was going to be the family business. I'm going to hand it down to the next generation, then the next generation. You don't see that happening as much. So you really have to treat it as a valuable asset and one that you can really derive some lifestyle from.
And to
Yeah.
answer your initial question, when is the best time to start planning? So let's say a business owner has been operating and has been busy trying to stabilize the business and then grow the business, et cetera, and they really haven't given any time or attention to the actual potential exit at some point in the future. I would say a good 5 years is a number that we should be looking at in order to make sure that everything is adequately reviewed and upgraded and taken care of. What would you think, Anthony? 5 years?
Yeah, I think that's a good term. Michael, some of the things that people have to look at are some of the things Joe talked about. If you're really looking to exit your business, oftentimes there are folks who, don't have kind of their legal house in order. So if they wanted to exit or someone knocks on the door and wants to buy their company, they're really not ready. Sometimes they really don't have, their ducks in a row. There's a lot of different things we can discuss as we go along that makes sense. But if you look at a 5-year horizon and you want to kind of get to a good point at that stage, it makes sense. You could always extend it, right? You're not forced to do it. But my point with folks is to always be ready. We could talk about some stories about folks who were and weren't ready and how they cashed out later on.
Well, and I could probably go into this, thinking about it this way, like how has planning been beneficial to the owner when the time to exit arrives? So, and we talked about that a little bit, but, so maybe we can just, just drill a little bit deeper on that when that time arrives, I mean, obviously the more you plan for that, the more you've actually thought about what that exit strategy is going to be, or what you're building up to get that proper exit, the better that exit would be for you, correct?
Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's look at it this way. If you're operating your business and you're giving all of your time and attention to the business operations, you often let some ancillary things go, such as keeping your financial statements perhaps up to par and making sure that they're accurate, and having the right employees behind you, people to operate the business perhaps if you're not available or just no longer there. So when we look at a business that's ready to sell and the buyer is lined up, one of the first things that the buyer is going to do is produce a due diligence request list. Mm-hmm. And that list can go on for pages and pages, and we'll have a data room that we're filling with all sorts of documentation regarding the history, both past and current, of the business. And I'm going through one right now, as a matter of fact, where we are literally pulling information out of the client, and they are searching through ancient history as far as they're concerned for corporate information and certificates of incorporation and the original shareholders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's holding up the buyer's due diligence process. So if you have all of those ducks in order, it makes it that much easier and that much more of a swifter process.
And Michael, I think you really need to look at the professionals you have that surround you and say, do I have folks who understand the process, folks who can help me? I mean, I think on one side, you need a good corporate attorney, somebody like Joe who understands the merger and acquisition process, but he also understands the whole exit planning process. So from the beginning of the life of the business to the point where it ends, where maybe you sell it, you got to have somebody who's kind of guiding the ship, so to speak. And I think people need to, there's many other professionals you need, somebody who's an M&A advisor who understands that, somebody can help you with your exit plan. You probably need somebody who's a very qualified CPA, because people sometimes forget about taxes and they don't really plan and realize what the level of taxation could be on a transaction. I want folks to stand back though and look at their business critically as if they were in fact going to be the buyer. And what would be the things that you would look at? What would be the things that you would analyze? What would be the things that you would criticize? What would be the things that would be non-starters for you? We want people to have bankable businesses, businesses where, for instance, if you took your business to the bank and you wanted to borrow money, you could borrow money, keeping in mind that the typical buyer is going to borrow money to buy your company. So I think, that critical approach with surrounding yourself by some really good professionals really will make the whole experience a way more pleasant, way more profitable, and also really kind of achieve your goals.
And that's a really good point, Anthony. Anthony, you need that team. You need a good team right along with you. And that team will be able to work with you and guide you through the process. And you can guide them as well, because there are a lot of things that the team members won't know in particular about your business. But working as a team, you cover all of the areas that need to be covered.
Excellent. And I think also too, like, and Joseph, go back about the me having all of your ducks in a row as well, is that speed is of essence, not just because you want to be able to have the transaction move swiftly and smoothly, but you also don't want to lose the buyer as well, right? Because if it drags on too long, at some point you could lose a buyer. They might move on to something else, I would assume. I mean, you don't want to spend 3 years acquiring a company, so unless it's a really good company, I guess. But
there's a lot of money out there waiting to be utilized, waiting to be spent on acquisitions and things along those lines. And a lot of these potential buyers will say, okay, you know what? I've been attempting to work with you, Mr. Business Owner, but there's been such delays or such inadequate information coming across that we're going to kind of go on to the next one who may very well be a competitor of your business.
Folks got to realize too, Michael, first of all, as Joe knows, we say time kills all deals, right? And I think it's no different than no matter what you're looking for. For instance, if you're going to buy almost anything, maybe you're going to buy a car, the longer you wait, the less likely is that person is going to get the sale. So I think that the second thing people need to realize is when your business gets to the point where it's going to be acquired, let's say your exit strategy was to get the business acquired at some point 5-10 years down the road, the buyer who's interested in your company is not just looking at your company. They're looking at a myriad of companies. They have cash on hand. They want to buy a good investable company. It could be in your industry. It may be in a different industry. And as if they find that company and they happen to be looking at your company and your company is kind of a little bit on the delaying side, they're going to go with the other prospect. And I'm not saying there aren't any other buyers out there, but sometimes we always say you got to strike while the iron's hot. You got to make sure that you really can maximize your value. You really want to get the best possible buyer. Ideally, what you want to do is have your business ready so that there's some competitive environment for your company too. And if you're waiting and waiting and waiting, those buyers will drop off. They don't grow on trees. And I think you have to realize that sometimes you have one and only one great opportunity to really cash out on what could be your largest asset.
Yeah. And I know that this is obviously much different, when we're talking about, so we look at, say, like the recent Twitter deal, for instance. I know it's much different. It's a public company, much larger. We're dealing with probably smaller, more private companies, but it seemed that whole deal, which seemed to be so messy, and I think that a lot of it was that Twitter wasn't even preparing itself to be sold. I mean, they probably had some exit strategy, but probably nothing that fast. I mean, but is there any way that, even though the scale is much different and some of the variables are different, is there anything that we can look at those kinds of deals, especially the ones that were very public, and learn from that? Is there anything we could take from, any lessons we could take from deals like that?
So Joe, I'll take it, to start. I mean, I think it's a great indicator of when I said earlier that you never know when the time will be when somebody comes knocking on your door. Now, I'm not sure they knocked on Twitter's door, right? But it's not like Twitter said, hey, we're going out to the marketplace to sell the company. Yeah. It's not like Twitter said, we're desperate and we need to have somebody buy the company. But what the deal would end up coming is if somebody's going to pay the right price, and that person comes to the table and it happens to be $44 billion, then maybe we could be for sale at that point. And I think individuals need to treat their business that way. And here's a case in point. We had a family that was family-owned business, father and son business, that was in the, we do a lot of work in the industrial section, HVAC and that kind of thing, which are air conditioning and that. And there were some larger companies that had decided they want to be in that industry, some of the private equity firms. And they were just marketing like crazy. And one of the companies that they came to was a company in our area and said, hey, we would be interested in buying your company. And the two owners said, who, me? They looked at each other and said, who, me? And unfortunately, at that moment, they were ill prepared for any kind of acquisition. A lot of different things we could talk about later that weren't in place. Management team wasn't in place. Financials weren't in place. That deal went by the boards. And I think that would have been, for those owners, it probably would have been, a $20 million transaction. And probably even after they paid their taxes, they may have had enough money, other than winning Powerball, they probably would have had enough money to kind of live their life pretty well. So I think there are a lot of, and Joe knows there are a lot of private equity and investors, there's family offices, a lot of different money out there, strategically positioned companies who are just looking. I was on a website today and the website said, hey, if you own a plumbing or an HVAC company, we're interested in buying you. This was a large company with investable cash. And it doesn't have to be, Elon Musk with Twitter.
Huh?
And to take it back to the team approach, Anthony, correct me if I'm wrong, but your business, you and your business are skilled at ferreting out those potential buyers and making a good match.
Right. Well, we will search for them, number one. And if they come to your door, we will tell you whether they are, in fact, a good fit, whether they're a good fit a lot of different ways, not just financially. It's not just about the bucks, because a lot of folks have businesses where they have a lot of employees who've helped them build the business over the years. And these are family-owned businesses, sometimes founder businesses. They want to make sure that the acquirer is somebody who's going to treat the family and the employees correctly. So we routinely look at that. Sometimes we'll actually go back to other transactions and other acquisitions they've made and inquire with the previous owners and say, hey, listen, how did the transaction go? How are you folks treated? Needless to say, if the buyer is giving us those companies, they probably feel pretty comfortable, but we could still read between the lines and see exactly how they're treated.
Makes sense. So many owners make the mistake of affecting their business valuations by reducing profits unnecessarily. For example, there's deductions of spouses, vehicles, personal vacations, phantom payrolls, a lot of those different things. Can you talk about some of those things that businesses might do that could affect valuation?
Well, I think it's a pretty common situation for business owners to take advantage, so to speak, of all of the items that you listed, Michael. And they feel that they are benefiting themselves, I suppose, by doing that. But first of all, they always have to sort of watch their back, because they never know who might be coming up behind them and saying, hey, well, what are you doing here? This is not an expense that you should be taking. But over and above that, when due diligence is in fact performed and the financial statements are reviewed, and the financial statements, let's face it, are the most important aspects of a transaction and making sure that the buyer knows what they're purchasing. When they start to look at financials like that, they're going to either walk away or say, hey, you've really been abusing these operations. And as Anthony said before, a large number of buyers are looking for lender or institutional financing also, and it's going to hold back any potential transaction, possibly for 3 or 4 years, because the owner of the business might then have to revamp all of their financial statements and stop doing a lot of what they have been doing to get the valuation back up.
And you know what happens, Michael? We routinely look at financial statements. So our policy is we want to look at least the last 3 to 5 years of financial statements that you have. And that's what the buyer wants to look at. And that's what, when you're doing any kind of exit plan, you should look at the 3 to 5 year span, as we said before. And we would go through a process where we would what we call normalize the financial statements, meaning that we would take the net income and then we would look at those, what we call non-business, non-recurring, one-time type of expenses and detail them. Now, I think it's okay for the normal and the typical expected ones, but I think if somebody abuses that, they can't really expect to get credit for all of it. And keep in mind, especially, you find some people who have businesses where, perhaps, they to try to minimize the taxes. Sometimes we tell folks you can actually build value in your business by paying taxes. It's a real popular statement.
I can only imagine.
It's a real popular statement, but typically for every dollar that goes back to your bottom line, depending on what industry is, at the time you sell the company, you're going to get 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 times that money back when you go to sell the company. And it's going to really help you with a better pool of buyers, because a healthier company, a well-run company, one that presents their financial statements properly, is way more attractive to a lot of the investors and buyers than one that perhaps is kind of looking to kind of take every nickel as a deduction. And sometimes people wonder if you are doing that, if you're performing those kind of actions with your financials, they wonder perhaps, hey, what did I miss? Is there something I missed? Is there because a seed of doubt, if somebody's going to invest $6 or $7 million in your company, all you have to do is have one little seed of doubt. And typically, Joe has probably seen a lot of transactions that get busted out because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And at that point, the parties are invested also. So they might have hired their accountant and their attorney and Anthony's firm and gotten that team together and spent money on fees and things of that nature. And to have it bust apart for reasons that didn't have to be in the first place is really a shame.
Well, I mean, you do mention that, paying your taxes is very important for an owner who's definitely in the exit planning process. But what are some of the most important tweaks that businesses who are in this process or who want to be in this process, what do you think are the most important tweaks they can make to help increase their value?
Make yourself totally unnecessary. And when I say that, it's tongue in cheek, because most business owners, as we know, sit at their desks for 10 or so hours a day and toilet whatever the business might require from them, and they can't get away from themselves. And that means on an ongoing basis that business requires their presence 100% of the time, 365, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not a good thing, because any potential buyer is going to look at the business and say, hey, this is either a one-man operation or one person is running the show here. And how are we going to operate that business after the acquisition? It should also be looked at from the owner's perspective to say, hey, if something should happen to me, if I should become disabled, or if I should happen to pass, what's going to happen to my business? I can't tell you how many surviving spouses we've met with that hold their hands up in the air and say, my husband or my wife ran this business. I have no idea of what to do now. And that business's value sinks immediately.
And you know, Michael, there's a few things to that question. You know, Joe is absolutely right. Years and years ago, when we were working with some smaller business, we used to say it's a man in a van who actually operated the business. You know, and he was, and it was the only one that the customers would deal with. But recently, I had a friend of mine whose father was a dentist, and the dentist suddenly passed away, and said, "What can we do with the practice?" And think about it: if you out there are going to a dentist, and all of a sudden your dentist is no longer there, are you going to that same dental office and going to whoever happens to be in that person's seat in terms of taking care of you? Probably not. So, you know, your business can vaporize at that point. So I think that the lack of dependence on you, maybe dentistry is a bad example because there's such a talent there sometimes, but I think in any industry that you are, you have to make sure you're not the only go-to person. Buyers today want to see a valid management team. They want to see some redundancy in terms of the ability to run the business. They don't want to see the entire operation dependent upon the owner. They want us to be able to take the owner out of the equation, like Joe said, kind of make yourself, you know, unavailable to a certain degree, right? And see that the business runs. You know, the second thing that they look at is many businesses have over the years have serviced customers that have been very valid and loyal customers of theirs. And I explained it this way. I had a client named Frank, and he said, you know, I've been in business for 30 years and I have 7 fantastic customers, and they represent 98% of my business. They pay on time. They've ordered forever. Buyer comes in and says, Frank, I love your business. You do a lot of business. You make a lot of money, but one of the problems you have is that you have 7 customers. And Frank thought that was a great thing, but the buyer said, hey, your number one customer represents 28% of your sales. If somehow that customer doesn't think they like me as much as Frank, or for some reason they have some financial problems, I'm severely hampered in terms of the business. So I want folks to look at their business, especially when they're looking at an exit strategy. Look at it critically, as I said earlier, and say, hey, what would be something that if I was a buyer, I would be nervous about, or I would find there to be a risk factor, and try to correct it during that whole exit planning process. And you can do that. Sometimes it's not easy with customers. You have to go and kind of spread out your customer base to a great degree. One of the other things we talked about is you have to have strong financial statements done by a CPA. They don't always have to be audited. They should be reviewed, but you have to have financial statements that are consistent, that tell the good story, that actually are kept in accordance to generally accepted accounting principles. So we don't want to go too deep into that, but when you're looking at maximizing the value of your business and you're really planning the exit, you really should really think about that. And I think a lot, what happens though, Michael, they say statistically 79% of business owners don't really have kind of a written transition plan. They don't think of any of these things. So I think those are just some of them. There's a lot of other ones that are important in terms of, you know, even on the legal side today.
Yeah, and once again, it's kind of like looking a little bit back at, you know, even though, like I said, it's much different scale in public versus private, but if you look at Apple back when Steve Jobs died, and there was a lot of concern that Steve Jobs was, the go-to person there, that once you lost him, what would happen to the company? And I mean, luckily it looks like Apple was able to pull through that. You know, I'm sure this will do very well, but that could be a concern, like if it is somebody who's a key portion, or if you keep all of your eggs kind of in a couple of baskets. So if you have 2 or 3 or 5, 6, 7 big clients and you'll lose one of them, I mean, that's kind of, that is kind of scary in a way, because you lose one and you're in deep trouble then.
Yeah, and some of it's ego, I think, because when you're a business owner and you've been making it happen for so long, you really kind of think the world revolves around you. And you're it in that industry, or you're it in that company. And you have to realize that that's okay if you expect to stay there for a very long time and there's nothing that befalls, that you're okay. But there's things you can't plan like that. Michael, you don't know. You don't know what tomorrow holds. So I think, for protection of yourself and for your family, even folks, I tell folks you really have to go through a kind of a serious estate planning process. And I know Joe does a lot of that. I think a lot of people, and it helps you with on the tax side as well. Joe, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that. I think that's an important factor here, especially when people are talking about exit planning.
Absolutely. So exit planning and estate planning absolutely go hand in hand. Because without an estate plan, you could sell your business and you could have a pot of money, and then that pot of money is lost to a great extent to estate taxes or to the use which it shouldn't necessarily be used for. So let's say a person dies without an adequate estate plan, their heirs at that point would inherit those assets, and the heirs might not be capable of managing the assets, investing the assets, or utilizing the assets for their best interest. So with an estate plan that's properly done and developed, and it does take a while to develop an estate plan, like an exit plan takes time as well. Fiduciaries, be it an executor or a trustee, will be put into place, and it will be people that the principal trusts to operate either the business or the post-transaction proceeds from the business, and make sure that those proceeds for the business are run smoothly and with professionalism, as opposed to giving it or leaving it to a family member who, again, might not know much. And in order to do estate tax planning, it's usually necessary to start early and to look at the assets and to separate them out and to segregate them so that the exact plan that takes place is in fact estate tax beneficial.
It's interesting, Michael, that, I'm quoting some statistics from the Exit Planning Institute, right? And that's where I get this CEPA designation. And they say 50% of all exits from businesses are involuntary. Involuntary meaning 50%. They're due to either death, they're due to disability, they're due to divorce, they're due to disagreement, or just general distress, where, business may have just no place to go. When you think about 50% of that, and you think about the amount of money invested, I don't want to scare everyone, but this is statistical, and it's you don't want to be in one of those categories. And there's a way to avoid being in those categories, generally speaking. Something sudden happens, you really can't help it, but I think you have to be proactive with it.
And from the planning perspective also, estate and trust planning also goes hand in hand with having the appropriate corporate or business documents in place as well. So if you're a corporation, you need that shareholders agreement. If you're an LLC, you need that operating agreement, and those agreements will have buyout provisions in them. So in the event of death or disability or incapacity, they will contain some sort of a provision to cover, be it through insurance, which is something that people don't often think about. They think about it for their own personal lives and their families, but they often don't think about it for their business interests. Or it might entail having an employee step up and purchase the business, or at least be able to manage the operations in the interim.
You need some contingency plan. You really do. And the last thing I say on the topic is, when you're looking at it from an exit planning standpoint, you got to look at, there's a few different factors, right? There's the business, which is part of your life and part of your world and all of that. Then there's the personal side of it. Because so many people really, quite frankly, their exit plan has to really have them consider what they're going to do. What's their next act? They sell the business tomorrow. What are they going to do? What are they going to do after that? What really are they going to do? So there's the personal part, there's the business part, and then wrapped around the whole thing is really the financial piece, because there's a financial factor to each one of them. And the personal part we find to be, I think there are more folks who suffer from, everybody heard about buyer's remorse, right? I think there are more folks who suffer from seller's remorse,
Hmm.
where, they can't really get to the point where they sell the company. And then, they do stay statistically. I hate to be a statistics guy, but 75% of the people who sell their business are not really excited or happy about what's the next act for them is. They haven't really figured that out. I mean, I guess if you're a big time golfer, that's okay. But a lot of folks who've been working 70 or 80 hours a week running their business haven't really had a lot of time to play golf. So it's something to really figure out from a personal standpoint, considering you've spent so many hours at your company, at your business, building it. And especially if, it's even almost worse in a lot of ways if you're the second or third generation in the business. And you don't see too many second and third generations taking over, but if you are, you've already had the pace set, and it's hard to break that pace. Joe, I don't know, do you see many second or third generations taking over?
Well, we see attempts for them to take over. And generally what happens specifically with respect to family businesses, as the families grow and children have children and they have children, and what the business used to support perhaps 4 people or 2 families, it's now supporting 24 people and 7 or 8 families. And it just becomes impossible after a while, because even though you have the people that are operating and growing the business, it's not expanding to the point where it can support that number of people. And it becomes problematic and usually results in liquidation. Also usually results in disagreements and arguments between family members, because family often do not get along, and when you mix money and business operations with it, it becomes that more problematic.
Yeah, for sure. So if well, one of the things that we hear a lot of, and and I think we actually even talk about this term a little bit, is the phrase value acceleration. So what exactly is value acceleration? What does that have to do with the entire, exit planning process?
So you want me to, Joe, or?
Yeah, please.
So
You're the
value
exit guy,
acceleration,
Anthony.
it's an interesting concept. So if you really are planning your business properly, and you say, hey, listen, I would like to make sure that the business has a value of X, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes over the next few years to make that happen, you can actually do things that would essentially help you grow that business. So you would accelerate the value. For instance, some of the things we talked about. If you're at the head and you need a management team, well, that is going to accelerate your value. It's going to actually improve your value by putting a management team in place. If you're going to have that issue with the number of customers so you need to spread out the customer base. You need the financial statements. For instance, there are a lot of folks who, they have some human resource issues, right? Some folks have some other legal issues, whether it be lack of contracts with customers, because there's a lot of value to be built when you have customers with contracts, because the buyer says, hey, that customer has some staying power, as opposed to just a casual relationship over the years. So when we say value acceleration, we look at what we call the value drivers in a business, the items that are evaluated by the buyer that they're going to pay you real value on, or they're going to decrease your value, and see how you can actually enhance that value. Joe, maybe you want to talk a little bit about, I know there's some of the legal part of it too, but some of the things that you see.
Well, I'm going to give my infamous example that you've heard in the past, Anthony, so you can take a break. But we're representing an estate right now of a woman who owned a commercial building in Lower Manhattan with her husband, and it was a mixed-use building. They operated a liquor store on the ground floor and residential apartments upstairs. The property is owned by a corporation, and after the death of the second spouse, the executor came to us and said, okay, we're in the middle of administering the estate. we want to start looking at selling this property. And we said, okay, bring all of the corporate records and books and information that you might have found at the decedent's business and bring them over and we'll take a look. And he came with about a half an inch of documents and nothing was really important at all. And after doing our own due diligence, we found that the corporate kit was never completed, so there were no stock certificates issued. So there is no definitive indication of who the actual owners or shareholders of the business or the corporation are, even though the husband and wife ran the business. The certificate of incorporation, and back then in 1938, certificates of incorporation used to indicate who the proposed shareholders of the entity would be. So there were two other individuals listed as proposed shareholders. And we have no idea of whether or not those individuals were ever actual shareholders. And we've done a search and cannot find those individuals at that point. I am sure they're long gone. We know they're long gone, but cannot find any family members, etc. We went further into our due diligence and found that the corporation never filed any income tax returns throughout its entire history. So you can't go with any information that might have been on the income tax returns, especially if it was a subchapter S corporation where you would have to list the individual shareholders. And people are often surprised that there is not a good definitive way sometimes from outside influences to determine who the owners of a business entity might be. And in this situation, we do not know. So we can sell an entity, but we can't indicate in our representations and warranties that would go into the transactional document that person A has owned this business for the last 45 years, and there are no encumbrances on the ownership, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we cannot sell this property, nor can we sell the corporation that goes with it. The building was appraised at over $12 million, and we now have a buyer for $4.5 million that we're selling whatever interest the decedent may have owned in the corporate entity. And that's it. We're making no representations and warranties. And the buyer is willing to take the chance that nobody is going to show up, come out of the woods and say, hey, I have a 30% interest in this entity, you owe me. The buyer is willing to take the chance that that won't happen, but they're only willing to pay $4.5 million for this property. So the beneficiaries of this estate are taking a huge hit. And that's not a value driver, right?
Oh my God, crazy. That's a crazy story, right?
They would have just completed those stock certificates and kept them in a file somewhere. Their value would have been more than double what it is today.
Yeah.
That's a big difference too. So just that one little, just one simple thing like that can just make a big difference.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
That's where it's important to have both of you, involved in something like this or be part of this, because if not, I mean, there's a lot of unrealized value that goes out, that just goes out the window.
And I can't tell you how many people we have come in either from a business planning perspective or an estate planning perspective, and we ask them to bring their business information, their corporate kits, whatever, and it's as new as the day they got it. They never even opened it. And they never really realized that they had to do anything with it, because whoever incorporated them, maybe they went through a service or an entity that really had no follow-up, no history with them, and no future with them, and they were incorporated and they thought that's good enough, but it's just not.
Yeah. I think one of the other things, Michael, is people have to really, this is a pretty big event, and it's a pretty big taxable event. I don't operate as anyone's CPA. Okay, I'm smart enough to know what I don't know, but I think they really need to seek the advice of somebody who is a tax professional. Because, if you happen to be, let's say, city-based, you'll be paying, federal taxes, you'll be paying state taxes, you'll be paying city taxes. And when the day is over, if you actually, have the ability to do some of that planning ahead of time, there's a way to offset some of that. There's a way to structure a deal so that you perhaps don't get hit so badly. But more importantly, you have to know, because if you're going to really start an exit planning process, right, you want to maintain your lifestyle at the end of the day after you sell the company. And really, it's kind of what you keep and not what you gross, right? You really have to see what you net out of a deal, because that's going to affect your lifestyle. If you happen to be fortunate, and let's say you still have 25 or 30 years left in order to live your life, perhaps you're not going to be making the same income from the business as you did. So now it's about what your savings look like. It's about what your investments look like. It's about what you netted out of the business. And you don't want to necessarily forsake your lifestyle just because you retired from the business. And I think a lot of folks do, and a lot of folks don't. A lot of folks plan pretty well. They have the right investment advisors. They have the right tax professionals. They have the right attorneys. And it really takes, you got to be serious about it. And I'm amazed, quite frankly, how many folks come to us and they go, well, you're a CPA. Tell me what I'll net out of the transaction. And I'll say, well, I have no clue what the rest of your life looks like. And plus, I don't really, that's not a service I provide.
Yeah.
I could recommend, very qualified CPAs, tax advisors, tax attorneys who can help you. And I think you really have to realize that just like the government will come after you seriously for the money, you want to be able to keep as much of it as seriously as possible too.
No, absolutely. One thing you probably, Joseph and Anthony, probably don't know is that I have my own business where I do artwork. And so you can see this is some of my work right here. It's very detailed. I know it's very experimental. But I wanted to sell my business, and I felt it was worth probably 15, 20 million. And come to find out, it's probably not. No, I guess I was told it was nowhere near. But seriously, but a lot of businesses, people, especially when they own these businesses, they have their businesses for maybe generations, even that they founded, they started. And so they have kind of grandiose plans like, oh, my business is worth X amount of money. But then you kind of step in and you find out like, not
really.
Yeah. How do you break that to owners? Like, how do you, what is that like? How do you advise them on that? And, and can I get 15 million for this?
Yeah, right. So with us, step one, Michael, is we say, hey, you need to get evaluation. And I would say we like folks to get a third-party independent valuation. We have the capability of doing that internally as well. But I want someone to see a professional who does this for a living to understand what the value is. And here's an example. I had a client who was referred by their financial advisor. They were in the technology sector. And just off the cuff, the financial advisor said to the client that, well, technology companies sell for a multiple of 7 to 10 times EBITDA. That's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And she came, and the client came to me, and I said, boy, I hope that's the case, but that is true for companies that may be doing $200 or $300 million in revenue. You're doing less than $10 million in revenue. So my expectation is that you probably would not get a multiple of 7, 8, or 9 times your business. So I said, but here's what I recommend. I could be wrong, right? So I said, let's get a third-party independent valuation. And we did. And it came out that the valuation was 4.25 times her adjusted EBITDA, okay, which was approximately half of what the person had told her. Sometimes we say, ask the owner what they want and cut it in half, but that's not a real good valuation technique. So I think you really need to go with the pros. There's a lot of great valuation people that we know here on Long Island or in New York City or just in the country. I'm sure Joe knows some of them. Joe, I'm sure you get clients who say, hey, I should get 10 million for my company. What happens?
Yeah, and on the other side of that coin, when people come in and say, I have a business worth $10 million and I want to do estate planning now, and they boast that their business is worth that $10 million, but when it's only really actually worth 4 or 5 million, it negatively affects their entire estate plan, because we might be doing estate tax planning work for them, and we want to keep the valuation as low as possible then for estate planning purposes. So there's a dichotomy. You want your business to be valued as high as possible for sale purposes. You want your business to be valued as low as possible for estate purposes. And when you plan to distribute your business or pass your business on to your family members, perhaps, you also want a low valuation. And people don't understand, well, why would I want a low valuation? Because when we look at the estate tax implications versus what you might be receiving, you might be paying a lot more ultimately down the road in estate taxes than you would if you were to persevere in getting more value out of the business. And there are other ways to get value out of the business also, aside from just looking at the purchase price.
Now,
Especially,
Michael, we don't want to, maybe your artwork, could have that intellectual property, could have some tremendous value that we didn't see. So I would make sure, you could always see an intellectual property attorney and see, and if you have that, trademarked and you have it, licensed, you may be a millionaire.
I saw Joseph eyeing this, by the way. So I see right behind you in your wall. This would be perfect right
Yeah,
there.
right.
bank, yeah,
Yes.
right at
I
the
think it
top.
would be.
People will be asking you, like, where did you get that? And then,
Yeah, you're not kidding.
like
The
you
next
said, I
Cabbage
paid
Patch
15
doll.
million for it. So, but well, what about, so talking about, we're talking about money, but we haven't really talked about like cash itself. So what about cash businesses? We're talking about like restaurants, for example, deal with a lot of cash. Does that, how can a potential buyer develop a comfort level in purchasing a cash business? Because obviously there's probably a bunch of variables that are probably not as certain as businesses that don't necessarily deal, so strictly with cash.
Yeah, well, first, any potential buyer should be looking at or doing a search for judgments and open lawsuits to make sure that there are no wage and hour claims, which have the potential to really implicate a business and drag it down. And I think that all of the regulatory powers that have come to be over the last few years are really looking hard at that and looking at whether employees should be designated as 1099s or employees, et cetera, and whether the businesses are paying the correct taxes and, for that matter, the correct wages. So that's from the buyer's perspective. They're going to look at all of that. But from the seller's perspective, you want to do the right thing, sort of in the same light as taking deductions on your income taxes and things of that nature. But from a buyer's perspective, the only really true way, and this is a really old-fashioned way, is to advise the buyer, okay, go in and watch the cash register. That's obviously sophisticated buyers are going to know what's being sold as far as inventory is concerned, et cetera, and they'll be able to work their actual numbers using that. But if you have a small business, I have somebody interested in buying a smoke shop now, and I'm wondering if it's because of the new marijuana laws coming down, but nevertheless, they're just buying a smoke shop and the records are not there. So they've been sitting there for the past 2 weeks watching people come and go.
So we routinely, we just don't really accept those as clients, quite frankly. People who have, cash and they expect to get value for it. If they realize that over the course of a number of years that maybe they have cash that has not been booked, they've benefited for all of those years. And really, the message is you can't get paid on the back end for it as well. It really is double dipping, right? The second thing is there are so many businesses today that I had a restaurant owners tell me that, there really wasn't much cash that comes in anymore because especially with folks younger than myself and younger than Joe, they don't know what cash is. They only use credit cards, right? Or debit cards. And the third thing is some of the taxing agencies are pretty aggressive. So if you're in a position where you're supposed to collect sales tax, you're really putting yourself at tremendous risk by actually operating in a cash environment and not recording it. It's one thing if you take the cash and record it. It's a whole nother thing if you don't. I think you're really subject to really, having some really serious penalties. And also, it may be worse. So, my message to folks is if that's something that you routinely do, then God bless you. But I don't think there's a buyer anymore. The buyers are way more sophisticated today, Michael, that buyers, they want to know what your financial statements say. And if something doesn't make it to the financial statement, it doesn't count.
Yeah, and that's super important too. And I know I spent many years as a business reporter, and you kind of start to learn how to read, public company filings and such, which
Sure.
Which you can, even as a private business, you can take a look at, what companies are required to provide and what they're required to put together. And that's probably a good thing to put have together yourself, because, that information is important for investors, and in public company, it could be important for somebody who's looking to buy your company.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, unfortunately, I can't believe it that, it just feels like we're just getting started, but we're not. It's we're right up at the top of the hour, and I wanted to know, Anthony, Joseph, any final thoughts that you wanted to share with everybody tonight?
Well, I'd like you to sign that artwork before you send it over.
Well, I better get a check first, Joseph. That's the. What about you, Anthony? Anything you wanted to share?
Well, yeah. Look, I just think folks just consider what your plan is, your personal life's plan, what happens with your business plan, and just try to have a plan and work a plan. Plan to fail, fail to plan. It's cliche-ish, but it's so true. And it's a shame if you see somebody who really has a tremendous value and they fail to kind of really pay the attention that it needs. There's such an opportunity out there. We have struggles in the economy today with high interest rates and everything, but the thing that remains is a demand for very well-run, profitable businesses. There's a tremendous demand out there that always has been, and I think there always will be regardless. There are some people who are entrepreneurial by nature. They're looking to buy your company. And if you're prepared at any moment to sell it, then I think you're going to really realize the great benefit, and you'll do a real service to yourself and your family.
Excellent. Well, and by the way, Anthony, where can people, how can people reach you?
Sure, they can reach me very easily, Anthony at the NYBBgroup.com, and my direct number is 516-346-5272. We're located in Melville.
Excellent. And Joseph, how about you? How can everybody reach you?
Sure. My email is jmilizio, my last name, at vmmlegal.com. Same for our website, vmmlegal.com.
Excellent. So Joseph Milizio, he is the managing partner of Vishnick McGovern Milizio, and also Anthony Citrolo. He is a CPA, a CEPA, founder of NYBB Group here, in Long Island. And thank you both so much. This is fantastic information. I know. I'm already looking to see who's going to buy my artwork right now, and get out of that business. I think it's time for me to exit that art business. I would say. Everybody else, please stay tuned for our upcoming webinars and events. You can find out more about those by visiting richnerlive.com. That's richnerlive.com. And again, thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, Michael.